Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Winecast. Much like the cast on Catalonia in Spain, this cast will be looking at a wine region within a major wine-producing country. In this case, Italy's Veneto region. A wine-producing area known both for a number of important Italian styles and wines, but also known for being one of Italy's most prodigious wine regions. Since this is the first time that I've done a cast dedicated to a single region in Italy, it would be a good idea to start with a quick brush-up of how Italy's quality system works and how its appellations are organized. Like other EU member countries, Italy ranks its production regions according to an appellation scheme based on 3 quality tiers, designed to distinguish between a top tier of highly regulated quality wines, a less regulated and more experimental middle tier of wines, and a largely unregulated bottom tier designed primarily for bulk wine production. The top tier of the hierarchy is broken into 2 categories: a DOC, or Denominazione d'Origine Controllata, appellation that makes up the basic category for quality wine, and a somewhat stricter DOCG, or Denominazione d'Origine Controllata e Garantita appellation. While the middle tier is occupied by regions called IGTs, or Indicazione Geografica Tipica, that were created to allow producers to experiment outside of the DOC-DOCG framework, and wines produced at this tier should not be thought of as inherently of lesser quality than those made at the top tier. At the time of this cast, late spring 2017, there were 329 DOCs in Italy spread across the 20 wine regions of Italy, including the Veneto. Each of the 20 regions has at least one DOC and obviously usually many more. 15 of the regions have at least one of the stricter DOCG production areas for a total of 74, and 18 of the 20 regions contain one or more middle-tier IGT regions for the total of 119 of those across Italy. Information about the region that a wine hails from, as well as about its place on the quality hierarchy, will be visible on a bottle's label. But if you spend time with Italian bottles, you'll also spot several other terms on the label from time to time that will have to do with different aspects of the wine's production and that it pays to be familiar with. Several DOCs or DOCGs are identified as classicos, and this impressive-sounding term just means that the DOC or DOCG so designated covers the traditional or classic growing area for the grapes made into a particular style of wine. This can actually be a very important designation because both before and after the development of the DOC system, the Italian wine industry went through a long period where the focus was on quantity over quality. To accommodate this need for more grapes, and lots of them, DOC boundaries were often expanded to take in areas that were less suited for quality grape growing, especially flat, very fertile areas that could grow a lot of grapes, while the traditional area that was known to produce quality grapes for a given wine accounted for an increasingly smaller amount of the fruit that went into that wine. To remedy this, a number of appellations, mostly DOCGs, were created that were limited to the pre-expansion areas for these wines and were assigned to consumers that the wine in the bottle was made from grapes coming from an area that had a history with this wine and a reputation for quality. Like Classico, Superiore is a fairly high-sounding term that has a fairly modest meaning. Wines usually qualify for this category by having a slightly higher alcohol by volume, around 0.5% to 1%, than the corresponding normale version of the wine. This may seem like an odd detail to focus on, but remember that alcohol is linked to sugar in grapes, and sugar is linked to ripeness, which is linked to the development of flavor. So a superiore designation indicates that the producer took a little more time to ripen the grapes in the wine, and that this wine might have a richer or more complex flavor profile than the normal version. Though it usually refers to greater alcohol, depending on the regulations of the DOC or DOCG that uses the term, superiore can also refer to extended aging and/or lower grape yields at harvest. Finally, riserva on an Italian wine bottle, like reserva on a Spanish bottle, is linked to aging and, depending again on the regulations of the specific DOC or DOCG, a bottle with this designation will have been aged longer than a corresponding normale, usually around 2 years longer, though sometimes quite a bit more than that. This category has generated controversy in Italy because while the idea was that producers would identify the wines that would benefit from aging when they first made the wines and then designate them as reservas before they started aging them, Italian wine law allows producers to designate a wine as a riserva at any point during its aging. And so you might find a situation where a producer has a surplus of a particular wine that he hadn't intended to be a riserva, and then decides to designate that wine with that term to give the wine both a prestige and a price bump, even if it doesn't benefit from additional aging and is otherwise identical to the Normale. That general information will be helpful with wines from all of Italy's regions, but for now, on to the Veneto. The Veneto is part of a larger cultural and historical zone in northeastern Italy called the Triveneto, or Tre Venezie, and that includes the adjoining regions of Trentino Alto Adige to the north and Friuli Venezia Giulia to the east. Both of these other two regions will eventually get their own cast, but they're worth mentioning together with the Veneto because all three of these regions share cultural and enological affinities with each other that they have in common with the neighboring countries of Austria, Slovenia, and Croatia, to which they have been sometimes politically as well as culturally joined over the centuries. The Veneto itself is the largest wine producer of the three and the largest wine producer in Italy, period, producing more wine than any of Italy's other 19 wine regions. The Veneto is also the largest producer of DOC-level wine in Italy, accounting for about 18% of the country's total quality level production. It's well known for both reds and whites, but produces a bit more white wine, even at the DOC level, than it does red. Like most winemaking regions, it's known for producing conventionally made reds, whites, and rosés, but the region has a number of signature wines that it's worth becoming familiar with, and these include a family of wines made using a process called appassimento that involves dried grapes, and includes the world-famous wine Amarone, alongside an equally famous white wine by the name of Soave. And finally, the Veneto's most important contribution to sparkling wine, Prosecco. Though there are lots and lots of grapes authorized for use in Veneto wines, the three most important red grapes can fairly be said to be Corvina, which is the most highly regarded of the three, along with its blending partners Rondinella and Molinara. A fourth grape, Corvinone, had been thought to be a clonal variation of Corvina until genetic testing showed otherwise. It's now known to be a distinct varietal, though closely related, and it can be substituted for up to 50% of the Corvina called for in a given blend. The Bardolino DOC and Superiore DOCG, as well as the Valpolicella DOC, make wines based on these grapes, though they differ from each other in character, with the Bardolino typically blending in less Corvina for a less structured wine than the Valpolicella. Amarone della Valpolicella, that we'll talk more about shortly, also uses these grapes. Bardolino wines can also be vinified as a rosé called a Chiaretto. On the white front, Garganiga, the world's 50th most planted grape varietal as of 2010, with almost all of those plantings in the Veneto, is the most important white grape in the region and is used primarily to craft Soave and its sweet variation Recioto di Soave. Like I said, there are a host of other local reds and whites, like Raboso and Trebbiano di Lugana, that appear in other wines as well as international varieties that have more of a presence in the wines of the IGT or the experimental tier. The use of dried grapes in winemaking isn't unique to this area by any means, but the Valpolicella region in the Veneto does show a remarkable flair for versatility when it comes to using such grapes, and there are at least 3 different styles of wine that are produced in this region, all linked to each other by working with grapes that have been dried. To start, grapes that are used to make Valpolicella are harvested and then air-dried slowly over the course of several months. This drying process is called appassimento, which means something like raisination, and refers to the grapes becoming more and more raisin-like as they dry out. Starting around mid-January following the harvest, the grapes are crushed like they would have been at harvest and are put through a long, slow, and very cool fermentation. If the winemaker further cools the fermenting must to a point that the yeast stop their activity, fermentation will be arrested and the must can be pressed and filtered to remove yeast and keep the fermentation from starting up again, and then bottled as a Recioto della Valpolicella, a wine with moderate alcohol, usually around 12%, as well as noticeable residual sugar. 2 other regions in the Veneto, Soave and Gambellara, use white grapes for the same process and produce a white Recioto. If the fermentation and the various steps after it are done in a pressurized tank that allows the winemaker to catch the CO2 produced by the fermentation, then the result is a sparkling Recioto. If, however, the producer elects not to stop the fermentation of the red grapes, or forgets, which is how this next technique is rumored to have been discovered, then the must will ferment to dryness, and the resulting wine, known as Amarone della Valpolicella, is produced as a DOC level wine in this region. It'll have a higher alcohol by volume, around 15 to 16%, and will not have residual sugar, but will have an intense concentration of flavor. Finally, if you take the pomace, or the pressed skins and pulp of the dried grapes, used to make either an Amarone or a Recioto della Valpolicella, and add that pomace to a batch of newly fermented wine made from the same grapes, then, thanks to added nutrients from the pomace for the still living yeast in the wine, a brief renewed fermentation will kick off in the new wine, bumping the alcohol up just a little, and the pomace will also contribute color and flavor to the wine, resulting in a ripasso della Valpolicella. Because dried grapes yield less wine by volume than fresh grapes, Reciotos and Amarones are expensive wines to make and expensive wines to buy. So Ripasso della Valpolicella has turned out to be a good way to get some of the intensity and flavor that you'd expect from an Amarone without breaking the bank in the process. Soave, probably the Veneto's most famous still white wine, is, at its best, a delicate floral wine that also has notes of pear, stone fruit, melon, and citrus, and that was a huge hit on the export market, especially during the 1970s and 80s, when it seemed like you might not be able to throw a rock in a wine shop without hitting a bottle of it. Its main grape is Garganega, that must make up a minimum 70% of the wine, but is often the only thing in the bottle. If it isn't alone in the bottle, then it can be supplemented by Trebbiano di Soave, which is known as Verdicchio in other parts of Italy, and by Chardonnay. Demand for Soave several decades ago was met by planting Garganega in all sorts of areas that didn't do it any favors as a grape and resulted in thin wines that were missing the vital aromatics that you'd find in the best bottles. So Soave is one of those wines where it pays to look out for the Classico designation, meaning that the grapes for it were planted in spots that helped to make its name in the first place. Soave can be made from dried grapes into Recioto di Soave, and both the non-Recioto and the Recioto can be made into a sparkling or spumante wine in either the Charmat or the traditional method. A neighboring region in the Veneto, Gambellara, also produces wines based on Garganega and makes them across the same stylistic spectrum as Soave does, with still, Recioto, and sparkling examples. Finally, we shouldn't leave the Veneto without a look at Prosecco, perhaps Italy's most recognizable sparkling wine. Prosecco is usually made as a Charmat or tank method sparkling wine, though you will see occasional examples of it made in the traditional method. There's a fair amount of variety, actually, in terms of how Prosecco can express as a sparkler, with most of the examples being a spumante, similar in pressure to a Champagne or Crémant, but you'll also see lower pressure frizzante wines, comparable to a French Pétillant, and even still or tranquillo examples with no bubbles at all, though those don't often get exported. 85% of a Prosecco must be Lera, a grape that, confusingly, up until a decade or so ago, was known by the same name as the wine, Prosecco. Though a Prosecco can be 100% Lera, a number of other local grapes, as well as both Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, known in Italy as Pinot Nero, can also be blended with the Lera up to 15% of the total blend. You'll see Prosecco produced under its own DOC, but most of the grapes for the wine made under this DOC are grown on flat, low-lying areas that aren't optimal spots for quality, so look for two DOCGs. The mouth-filling Conegliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco Superiore and the much easier to pronounce Asolo Prosecco Superiore, both of which grow their grapes on hillside terroirs. And if you can find it, look for Superiore di Cartise, a Prosecco from grapes grown on a hilltop in Valdobbiadene that's widely, though not officially, considered to be a sort of Grand Cru for Lera and the Prosecco made from it. Thanks for joining me for another Winecast. There's much more to cover in the Veneto, but this should get you started if the region is new to you or if you just want some more information about it and its remarkable wines. Having done this for about a year now, I've noticed that I've developed several distinct genres for casts, and while I always want to do a mix of things, I'm wondering which you, my viewers, prefer or want to hear more of. Should I do more about wine regions and their styles and laws, more about wine science and technology, or maybe more about individual grape varietals, or something else altogether? Please let me know in the comments, and thanks for all the great comments and requests that I've already received. I'm your host, The Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.